Hi friends, this week Johnson gets us deep into the first theological chapter of her book, Ask the Beast. And this chapter focuses on the pneumatological aspects of God's relationship to creation. In Wisdom 1, verse 7, she quotes, "The Spirit of the Lord has filled the world, and that which holds all things together knows what is said." Now, in order to describe this, there are three ways that we've historically spoken about creation. And Johnson introduces the notion of creatio originalis, that is the original act of creation, creatio continuo, the continuous nourishing or dynamism of creation, and creatio nova, or the new creation, which of course is that eschatological vision of what is to come after the end times, or the parousia. But in this chapter, we focus on creatio continuo, as she begins with the fundamental affirmation that for creation to be continuously happening, the Creator must be continuously present and active. And this calls us to reconsider what we mean when we talk about what is natural, or what is the relationship between nature and grace, what is unseen and seen, when we contemplate or study nature or the natural world. She cites a few obstacles to accepting this idea of creatio continuo, or seeing the Spirit at work in the natural world. And the first is that basic anthropocentrism that's present in most religions or religious philosophy. For Christianity, our anthropocentrism is rooted in the Hellenistic philosophy, which is to say our Greek philosophical heritage that goes back to Plato and Aristotle. They posit that there is a difference between spirit and matter. And many influential church fathers, and they were specifically fathers, worked within this Hellenistic mode and began to interpret theological categories such as salvation through an anthropocentric lens, meaning that the goal or the end, the telos of God's work in creation, is focused on the status of human spirits. And even more specifically, a hierarchy at the top of which was male ones, which was that specific meaning of the word anthropos. Now, the split between matter and spirit was, of course, magnified in the Enlightenment with the birth of Cartesian duality. Descartes posited that more extreme position that we are equated with our rationality, with what we think. So not only is our spirit and matter divided, but our lived reality, or our being in the world, is divided between the subject who thinks and the object that is thought about. And to this genealogy of obstacles, I would also add personally the scientific revolution that began in the 17th century. The inductive theories of Francis Bacon, coupled with the physics of Newton, introduced the idea that the natural world was a mechanism that can be mined and manipulated without spiritual or organic consequences. Incidentally, at the same time, advances in medicine began to see the human body in the same way, and specifically the female body. While we could continue to think about the sources of this dualism, the point is really that they all work within that metaphor of ascent that we thought about last week, that hierarchy of being, and that dualism that divided spirit from matter. This scientific and philosophical dualism was further complicated when liberal economics started to take hold. And John Locke was famous for having codified the idea of usage value. That is, nature is only valuable if it's economically useful. Now, this got coupled with common British law about usage. If you were using the land, it was yours. If you were making it produce economically fruits, then it was yours. Or vice versa, if you were not using the land to produce, then you can't claim to own it into perpetuity. And here we see the basis for colonialism, when it appears to the colonials that indigenous people aren't using the land to produce to its maximum the way that Europeans were used to. Now, I digress here a little bit, but Johnson recognizes the importance of this when she writes, quote, "Even when the natural world was granted a certain value, this was based on its usefulness for human beings, not its own merits. These frameworks of thought have little room for the natural world's intrinsic worth." And she continues, consequently, in David Burrell's astute insight, late medieval theology drew the implication that the natural world is not a gift, but simply a given. And the result of all of this is what Joseph Sittler calls a doctrinal cleavage in Christendom that has been an element in the inability of the church to relate the powers of grace to the vitalities in the process of nature. And that's what we're trying to reconnect today. Johnson affirms that the way to heal this cleavage is to return to our confession of God as Lord, the giver of life, to reclaim our focus on God's immanence in the world. And the psalmist sees this presence of God, asking, where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you're there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning or settle at the farthest limits of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me. Read these words, Johnson says, with your image of the entangled bank in mind, and already it slips out of being relegated to natural as opposed to supernatural. The imperishable spirit, she writes, in all things is God's spirit, the spirit of love, calling forth and preserving and opening to the future everything that exists. And so she quotes Walter Casper as writing, the natural world is already, always more than pure nature. Through the presence and action of the Holy Spirit, creation already, always has a supernatural finality and character. That's an end quote. And we only have to reclaim this voice in our faith because in early Christianity, this concept was present. The life-giving Trinity was there. Johnson's right to say there was no formal doctrine of the Trinity, but the faith experience required this kind of threefold language. And Irenaeus was one of those early church fathers who used this threefold language. He had a different notion of atonement, and not surprisingly, a Trinitarian concept of God's ongoing relationship to creation, using that image of the two hands of God, Word and Spirit, creating and sustaining. Of course, there were Trinitarian controversies that get us deep into those lingering difficulties of talking about the essence or being of God. But Aquinas finds it suitable, as Johnson writes, that God proceeding by way of love be called Spirit, indeed Holy Spirit, because love implies a kind of moving force, a compelling energy akin to what we mean by Spirit, end quote. So if love is the essence of God, as the letter from John says, then we're left with the idea of perichoresis, or that relationship, the dance, a sharing of love, which that coming together and sharing of love begets and then nurtures life. And Johnson shares the wealth of biblical images that try to communicate this loving, life-giving relationship. She recalls wind, ruach, water, as in baptism, fire, as in the Exodus, and also baptism. And it's appropriate this week to acknowledge Stephen Hawking's famous quotation in his book, Brief History of Time, where he asks, what is it that breathes fire into the equations and makes a universe for them to describe? Of course, she goes on to talk about the image of the bird, both in spirit and in its maternal nature. Wisdom from Sirach, and wisdom in the Proverbs. And of course, most of these metaphors for the Trinity are natural, precisely because they're organic, like that entangled bank. In the way that they reveal the mystery of life, we see reflected that vision of life and spirit, which Julian of Norwich, who in it all saw God's love at work in that interstitial spaces giving life. Ultimately, this is not a systematic claim, but a creedal one, a statement of faith, about which Johnson writes, when the Nicene Creed calls the Spirit the giver of life, vivificantem, the vivifier, it's giving a creedal blessing to the earlier biblical and later doctrinal idea that creation is not just a one-time event in the beginning, but entails the presence of the Spirit of God every step of the way. And finally, we participate in this life-giving relationality. That's what it means to be. Walter Casper writes, the meaning of being is to be found not in substance that exists in itself, but in self-communicating love. So we keep God's essence separate from creation, but we affirm a deep, immanent relationship, affirming that the Spirit of God, love, is in all things, continually acting, healing, and creating life. This is the meaning of panentheism, God in all things, love in all natural things, and our relationship to one another. So Johnson ends up affirming this ineffable mystery in which we, quote, live and move and have our being. That's from Acts. The quote at the beginning of this chapter from Martin Luther reminds us that Luther saw this mystery and also affirmed that we participate in this life-giving communion with the immanent plenitude of divine love that births, nurtures, and sustains, cares, and reconciles all creation. God, the Spirit of God, is behind the masks of creation, as Luther believed, and it is a sacramental presence. We participate in it. So when we look at nature, to study it or to contemplate it, inductively or deductively, we can see goodness, not just behind it or above matter or nature, but in creatures and their relationship to one another. So nature in this way is re-enchanted with God's Spirit. We don't just see matter, we see creation. For the natural world is God's dwelling place. Darwin saw it in the entangled bank, and we see it too if we dare to contemplate and ask the beast. So in this chapter, we've considered God's presence in the natural world, and next time we'll think about creatio continuo, at work through the mechanism of evolution.